Hi, I'm excited to be here today at DevOps Enterprise Summit. Let's get started. My name is Fischer. I'm co-founder and CEO at Tidelift, and I'm excited to talk to you today on the topic of thinking upstream about White House Cybersecurity Executive Order 14028. Bit of a wordy numeric title, but hopefully you'll get a lot out of this conversation. So what do you need to know about this White House executive order and what it means for your world? Well, let's start with some of the basics. So today I'm going to be specifically focused on how this executive order and a number of events that have occurred after it and in its wake impact application development teams and the way that they build their software today. First, just to establish some of the facts. First thing is that in May of this year, 2021, the White House released an executive order with a series of detailed directives focused on improving the nation's cybersecurity. Of course, many of us will recognize that this was in response to quite a number, an increasing cadence of high-profile software and cybersecurity attacks. For example, the one that impacted a whole bunch of SolarWinds customers and organizations relying on SolarWinds products late last year and early this year. And the third fact to point out is that this potentially has pretty large impacts on all kinds of organizations who develop software, and especially those that use open source software to develop applications. And there's more and more details and standards and requirements that are emerging every day. So this is what we want to talk about today and help you understand a little bit about what are the actual requirements, what's the process that's unfolding, and then try to come up with recommend some good ways that you can approach dealing with these requirements and dealing with the reality that's happening. So when the White House executive order first came out, a lot of organizations looked at it and sort of dismissed it initially, saying, well, this doesn't really seem to be about us. We're not a United States federal agency. We don't primarily sell to the U.S. government. And that sort of misses one of the core intents of this federal initiative, which is not just to uplevel the security profile of the U.S. federal government, but also to uplevel the rest of our digital infrastructure as well. I think it was said really well in this quote here. In so many areas of computer security, what the U.S. federal government does first, the private sector follows. When the federal government is requiring here will likely become the standard for all software moving forward, not just in the United States, but internationally. It's the express intent of the federal government to try to set a higher bar here and raise the stakes, not just within the government and its direct suppliers, but also its indirect suppliers and really all of the critical digital infrastructure in the country. So as I mentioned, one of the critical areas of focus in the Cybersecurity Executive Order applies to software supply chain security. And that's really meaningful for application development teams in organizations that build, software-powered solutions. Now, there are several provisions in the White House Executive Order that pertain here. One of those is that the Executive Order directed that the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, solicit input from other government agencies, academic researchers in this area, and other organizations and market participants to try to crowdsource essentially what should the standards and best practices for improving software supply chain security be. And it set a specific timeline for that as well. NIST was required to conduct this solicitation of input within 90 days of the May 2021 executive order. And there are other requirements as well. So, for example, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or NTIA, was separately required by the executive order to publish a minimum requirement for what's called a software bill of materials for any software solutions being sold to the government. And as you can appreciate, it's been a couple of months since this executive order first dropped, so now some of those deadlines are coming upon us. We're past some of those deadlines, and some of the details are emerging. So, for example, on the NIST website today, you can find actually a very long and extensive document describing security measures that critical software, and in many cases, any software that's being provided to the US federal government, will need to comply with going forward. And not surprisingly, one of the key aspects of those security measures that matters for application development teams is that they're going to need to establish and maintain this baseline inventory of the components and versions of components that go into their application. NTIA also delivered within its required time frame that initial set of requirements for what's called the minimum elements of a software bill of materials. So a software bill of materials is fairly straightforward to understand. It's basically an ingredients list for any software artifact. And for those who are using open source to develop applications, coming up with this bill of materials or ingredients list for your application and testifying to some of the attributes that software meets raises some pretty tricky questions, actually. I mean, when it comes to traditional commercially produced and sold software, it's very clear who the supplier of that is. It's the company. It's whoever sold it to you, the vendor of it, right? And they're the ones that you would go to ask clarifying questions around, for example, the original authorship or the security practices that are being applied in the development of that software. But when it comes to community-created open source software, which comprises more and more of the applications that every organization is building these days, who is that supplier? I mean, is it the original open source creator that opened up the